We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I have John F. White from Crekenford joining us today. How are you, my brother?
How do you do, Derek? I am tickety-boo. Thank you very much.
I'm so glad you're joining me, man. You have had quite a successful channel lately this year, and you're educating people. I noticed people really enjoy the oldest stories, oldest myths. And of course, I've always enjoyed talking with you and learning from you about some of these stories you've discovered. So today I figure we would do a dive and allow you to elaborate on some of the oldest myths that we have uncovered, discovered, or at least somehow have come down to us today. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself as I plug your channel.
Okay, well, I'm John F. White. My channel is called Crekenford, and the purpose of Crekenford is to discuss mythology and its origins and what it is actually about, because there's a lot of misinformation on the internet regarding mythology, especially around religious information as well, which is why our paths have crossed. I particularly specialise in what we call Indo-European mythology, so mythology that spreads around Europe and across Persia and into India, but I've become far more familiar with world mythology in the last few years, partly because of the Crekenford channel. And so we can today talk about the creation of the world, the creation of humans, how they die, what happens when they die, and what happens when they live, and how they keep the world in order or not.
Thank you, John. I really, really look forward to hearing what you bring today. You've had quite a successful story here. Look at your subscribers. You have 103,000. When I met you like 8 months ago, you had 3,000.
Definitely, yeah.
So, or maybe it was about a year. Maybe I'd say about
3,000 though. Yeah, it was a very small channel. Just interviewed Dr. Carrier.
That's right. I was just looking at the historicity right here. So
yeah,
1 year ago.
He was my most popular video 6 months ago.
Yeah, you thought, man, if I could just get another hit like that, and it was like 5,000 to 10,000 views, and you were like, man, if I could get another hit. And your latest and greatest right now, that you just launched 11 days ago, has 540,000 views practically. So I hope people realize that when they least expect it, keep working, don't give up. Just like MythVision's not going to give up. I expect someday to ride I like to call it the YouTube wave, and we'll grow. We'll get more people to understand.
You deserve it.
Yeah, get them to know these stories and to take a deeper dive, because this stuff is fun. I also want to just give a quick plug to my Patreon. Help us out. Join us. I have a lot of content in here that isn't public, that is like tons of stuff buried deep down in here. So please consider checking us out. Help support what we're doing. We are bringing education. I'm hoping YouTube finally recognizes that as well, because I'm actually interviewing the academics on many subjects, specifically Bible related. That doesn't mean we aren't going to get outside of that. I mean, I've been doing Islam, of course, which is Abrahamic, but we're gonna dive into other mythologies and, of course, other world religions. So, John, enough about my plugging and your YouTube. I did pin the comment, told everybody, you gotta join. You gotta go subscribe to Crekenford. If you don't,
appreciate it.
What are some of the punishments that the ancient myths offer people who have lived bad lives or whatnot?
Well, you don't get to go to the other life, the life beyond, and that's quite interesting. So let's talk about death then, or immortality. So one of the things we've learned from mythology, let's have a quick talk about mythology, because many people say what I talk about is rubbish. Certainly religious people think, how can you know a story that's older than the Epic of Gilgamesh? I get that a lot. Now, because they believe the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest story we know. Well, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest written story we know. But if we have people in South America and North America, in Siberia, in Europe, in Africa, all telling the same story, using exactly the same words or the same names, then chances are they're all telling the story from the same source. And if they're all over the world like that, that source has to come from a dispersal from Africa, probably around 60 to 70,000 years ago. Now, there'll also be people saying the out of Africa theory has been debunked. It has, in terms of that wasn't the first dispersal of humans out of Africa. We're fully aware that there are hominids in Eurasia for long periods of time before that, but the DNA of people who aren't in Africa today, their heritage-wise, stems from the out of Africa group of people, 60,000. So therefore, we believe that they would be taking the culture and stories with them. So that's sort of a sub-note that people need to know, because they'll get a lot of questions about that. So what we know is that when we look at myths of death, it's quite clear that our ancestors 50 to 100,000 years ago thought we were immortal. But then something happened to stop us being immortal, and so we started to die. And the stories we tend to get, there's a few of them, but they tend to revolve around objects that look like they are immortal, such as snakes. So snakes shed their skin, and so it looks like they get a new body, so they must be immortal. Or the moon, it's a full moon, then a new moon, then a full moon. That's got to be immortal. So they tell stories where the moon or the snake stole our mortality, and they have things. And that's quite interesting. And one of the other things you see is stories that we become mortal because we take a gift unnecessarily. And there's a story of, I think this is from Africa, West Africa, where someone's in the woods and says the name of this evil character. And as soon as he says the name, that evil character can feed the person. Okay, and then when he takes the food, he says, but now you've said my name, you will now die because you said my name. And if you tie that in, this evil character taking away immortality, if you tie it with they're taking a gift of food, and if you tie it with snakes being immortal, can you think of any stories in the Bible that have someone talking to a snake that gives them food that takes away their immortality?
Right.
And so everybody thinks, and we often see, say, one of the other myths is that man loses their immortality because they gain knowledge of sex. That's really old. That's a really old myth or motif. So the story of Adam and Eve is a story about actually losing immortality and being mortal, as opposed to really gaining knowledge.
I am a big fan of discovering where things come from, right? I like detective work, looking for the thumbprint that kind of tells us, man, this seems like this goes from a different place, somewhere older. And I saw a presentation, I can't remember by the academic, I emailed them, and, I always try to email. I don't care how famous they are or not, I try. And I haven't gotten a response back. Maybe I need to try again. And sometimes stuff goes to spam. But his argument, and he had a PowerPoint presentation, was what we see in Mesopotamia is also somewhat, there are connections, or at least some relationship, it looks like, to stuff that's over in India, in
oh yes,
Proto-India.
absolutely.
There is some connection and correlation, and people are like, okay, how did this happen? His hypothesis was that they both stem from a common source.
Yes.
Some previous civilization that had this, somewhere there's a split, and the narrative that we find about the flood stories, the creation myths and stuff, comes from a I guess you'd say proto-Indo-European civilization. Yes. And this is where these two myths come out of, because I was like, man, the oldest writing, literal writing that is like, alphabetic, if you will, is Mesopotamian. Most academics at least agree with that. There's still like a debate. Some people want to argue Egyptian somehow, possibly, but like they're close. I mean, they're very close. There's a big relationship there, but it's like 4,000, 5,000 year old writing. Like there's nothing before that. But these stories we know go before written history.
Exactly.
And so
And, yeah.
I don't know if you want to take us like on a timeline or however you want to go about this.
So what we find is we start developing these things when we stop being hunter-gatherers and we start farming. And that happened probably around 13,000 years ago. So just after a period in time called the Younger Dryas period, where we had a sudden cooling and a sudden warming of the earth. And that sort of disrupted the climate significantly, disrupted what was growing, disrupted animals breeding. It wiped out a lot of megafauna, we call it, so large animals. And so there were a number of drivers, I think, that forced humans to start farming. And there's also the immortality key aspect as well, that if certain ergot funguses on grasses may have allowed people to want to farm grasses rather than wander around. So I think there's a number of things going on there. Not any one thing would be the deciding factor. I think there's a number of things going on. And so when people start forming a large group, because you can when you farm, because resources are more, then that inspires innovation and that inspires writing, and you start seeing that a proper culture develop, and then that starts splitting off. And that's what happened, I would say, in southeast Turkey. So it's all Anatolia, corner of Iraq, Persia, north of Israel, that kind of area, Syria, and then it splits out, and that's right by the Near East. So the first thing you do in that area is probably sail down the Tigris and you head up, and that's really how we see civilization develop. So those people had stories, and they had stories they had from the hunter-gathering world, which obviously developed, and you find myth changes dependent on your environmental and social considerations. So whilst there may well have been dragon slaying myths before agriculture, when agriculture happened, dragon slaying was all about water. And actually what we find is that the earliest dragon myths are about water, but it happens that the snake often comes from the ground and makes pathways through the land, that creates rivers and puts water on the land for hundreds of years, and that makes things grow. And in effect, the dragon is a benevolent creation beast. But
so
then
can I just emphasize stuff as we go along, because I love this. If you were an ancient person, pre-scientific, even pre-modern civilization according to agricultural terms, and you're observing the world around you, and you notice snakes that are actually slithering on the ground and the kind of impact they make in the sand, you're going to notice curvy lines. Let me do it like this: curvy lines in the ground. So then there seems to be, how we call sacred geography, right? There's this sacredness about geography. Everything was sacred to the ancient. Like today we go, oh, it's a volcano. Oh, are you kidding me? If you were to ask the ancients, they would not just say this is a volcano. You got to really enter that world. And John, you do it better than anyone I know. And that snake that makes that twirl looks like the creek or the river that is so
and it's pushing earth out the way as it goes, so it makes hills and mountains, and that's it. So that's the rainbow serpent of Australia, or the rain snake of South Africa. That's the stories we see. But then when agriculture starts happening, the snake turns into not creating water at the start of the world, it creates rain to keep the crops going. And so the slaying of the serpent or slaying of the dragon comes out, and we see that in Indra versus Vrta in the Vedic culture. So in India, we see this storm god kill this dragon, and it rains, and that's when you get the rain season. And actually, you can apply that then to other cultures, and you'll find that Tiamat, so Marduk versus Tiamat, is literally a copy of Indra versus Vrta. So they're both water serpents. And because they cause floods, and because of the water, they destroy life. They represent the heads of all the evil beings. The gods, if you read the story, the gods don't face the dragons first off. They're scared to. If you remember in the Enuma Elish, he says, "Oh, go off." I think it's it goes off to have a chat with them, doesn't, and goes away and says, "Oh, Tiamat said this," when they didn't, and that started the whole thing. That happens. You find that the hero is often described as being beautiful. They both have a pre-fight banquet, a meal and a celebration. In India, it's the Soma, which is again links to the immortality key. They both have the same weapons: a bow. They have nets. They fight from chariots. They have help from winds.
Oh wow!
So, and they're both gods of vegetation and war because they cause rain and that. So, and at the end, they both crush the head of the dragon, and they create heaven and hell from it. So, yeah, they split Tiamat split in two to create the firmament. Vrta, from Vrta, I think the world is split into heaven and earth. So we actually see that Vrta and Tiamat, the stories of them are the same, and yet they seem to be very different cultures. With the Vedic culture obviously stemming from the Indo-European, but the Near East culture not. So you think, how did that happen? And that's because there's a common source, which is probably the agricultural myth happening before that.
Wow. Okay, there's a lot here. So maybe for our audience who hasn't heard the details of these stories, it might be worth telling the stories in a way as we go, because someone might go, yeah, okay, I've heard of Tiamat, but I don't even know who Tiamat was, or I might have heard of Gilgamesh, or I might have heard about some other myth.
Tiamat would be brilliant, because Tiamat could blow your mind if you're not really familiar with the story. So the story of the Enuma Elish, and this is a real synopsis, is that the cosmos is a watery cosmos, a watery chaos, and in there are two serpents. So there's Tiamat and Apsu, and their main and Tiamat means deep sea, and Apsu can mean sort of fresh water or higher water. There's various translations, and these breed and create families of monsters, and some of these turn into good guys, and some of them turn into bad guys. And like all things, there tends to be a fight. And so the good guys eventually name Marduk, who's this all-powerful god, as a hero to kill Tiamat, or the Apsu's killed a bit earlier, and he killed Tiamat. And he kills Tiamat, and this is quite important, by using magical wind to blow down her mouth. She's a female serpent, so her mouth stays open while the wind's going down, and then shoots an arrow into her to kill her. And then when she's dead, cuts the head off and splits her into two and creates the world. So it's a real creation myth. Now, if you understand that and wrap it up into one sentence, maybe two, you get the first lines of Genesis in the Bible.
Yeah, so the Tahom in Hebrew, the Tahom, exactly. There seems to be a correlation.
The wind blows over the sea, length of Marduk blowing water into Tiamat. Yeah, exactly. It's
and there's chaos. Well, is it chaos? It says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void. So there's like this void of chaos, and darkness was upon the face of the deep.
Exactly.
The Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters, the chaos.
So it's the wind of God. So the early translation from the earliest Hebrew it does mean wind and not spirit, which is why you get a closer link. And and so anybody listening to that in Canaanite or what is now Israel, if they heard those lines, they think, oh, that's the Enuma Elish, and they'll be listening to the story and waiting for the next bit. And I think that's sort of part of the hook, so to speak. So yeah, so that's where that is. But that creation myth is quite interesting for another reason, which is how the earth is made. And we can talk about that. So splitting something into two, or creating the earth from a body of a sacrificial being, and normally a twin, so because there was Apsu and Tiamat, is again a very common pretty worldwide belief, and certainly key in Indo-European belief.
Okay, so tell us, going into the Indo-European mythology creation myth, tell us that story and how it relates to the one we just talked about. And then we might go to its daddy and ask about what that story may have been, and go from there.
Okay. So the Indo-European story, so the Proto-Indo-European story, so probably 6,000 to 8,000 years old, I'll put a figure on, has void at the beginning, and out of that, two primordial beings come into play. They're not called Tiamat and Apsu, they're called Manu and Yimo. And Manu means man, and Yimo means twin. And Yimo is a very important name to remember, as well as Manu. And what happens is these people, and they're also with a giant cow, and that's also a quite important thing, because cows at the time, after agricultural farming, there was pastoral farming, and cows are incredibly useful. That you could use every part of the cow's body, so they must be a gift from God, because why would something so perfect be created otherwise?
And just to emphasize something, is that why there's still a remnant of holy cow, or at least the idea in Indian tradition that cows are sacred? They still hold on to this
So
today.
we'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
So
okay.
in the earliest form of the myth that we can reconstruct, Manu sacrifices Yimo, and with Yimo's body creates the world, and then creates man from the leftover pieces of Yimo's body, which is also an incredibly important piece of motif we can look at later about differences between men, because it talks about kings and priests and warriors. And then and the cow gets to live, but you see this myth change in other traditions. And so when it gets to India, it's the cow that's sacrificed to create animals and vegetation, and because it gives life to those things, it's then considered sacred in the Vedic culture, and that turns into Hinduism, and the cow is sacred there.
Right.
But they still have Manu and they have Yimo. Again, direct related to the Manu and Yimo of Indo-European. We see Tacitus write about Manu and Twisto in the Germanic culture from 2,000 years ago. Twisto is twin cognate with Yimo. We have Ymir in the Nordic languages, so in Scandinavia, linked to Yimo. So even Romulus and Remus. Romulus, his god form is Quirinus. Quirinus comes from, I think it's like
in that sky.
Romulus.
Quirinus.
He has a god. That's the god flavor of Romulus.
Okay.
So Romulus became a god. He wasn't originally a god. In the original story of Romulus and Remus, and this is where two Roman people create two cities, and one of them becomes the head of Rome, and so Remus dies, and Romulus kills Remus basically, and that's sort of one part of the sacrifice. But at the end of the original story, Romulus gets quartered by the Senate. So in effect, he's created Rome and then he's sacrificed, which is a slight reflex to being sacrificed and then create the world. That's been twisted a bit. You can't kill the hero of Rome, and so they changed the story to make Romulus turn into a god in the later versions of the story, and then it becomes Quirinus, and Quirinus is actually cognate to Yimo. So
there's a lot of etymology here too for people who are watching, like connections in language here. But just getting back to your point, in the Proto-Indo-European mythology, the cow is sacrificed, and
in some of it, yeah. So certainly in the Persian, and so what I call the Indo-Iranian flavors of the myth, you see the cow take a more important role, and that's because pastoral farming was significantly more important. What you find in the myths of Europe is that the cow is suckled. So in the Nordic myth, you see Ymir suckling on a Thumbla, which is the name of the cow in the creation myth. But in Romulus Remus, you see Romulus Remus suckling on the wolf, because it is a sort of like evolution in it. So they're suckling because Europe was still more in an agricultural phase rather than a pastoral phase when we believe the myth came there.
And just so people understand, and I'm not trying to be funny, a lot of ancient religions that are held by fundamentalists, there's a lot of radical stuff that comes from this. But I was watching a video not long ago, just going through my feed. You know, we have all these shorts, right? And so you get trapped in like searching through the next 30-second video. And there's a guy bathing in cow dung in India. And they like believe that this somehow has magical properties, that there's still today people doing this. And it's just to give you a point, like for the audience listening, that's how important the cow was in certain mythology, that they will literally bathe in its dung today.
And in fact, it's so important. What you actually find is that in a slightly later version of the Enuma Elish, where some tablets were found, so the version we tend to read was translated in the early 20th century, but tablets found in the middle of the 20th century translated, and that has Tiamat described as a cow. So it's
there's
like
your connection.
There's like a sort of more influence coming back in. So a lot of people say, oh, the Indo-Europeans didn't influence the Near East, but they were trading. Certainly the Near East was trading with India. So there's different ways that the interaction could have taken place. So before the agricultural tribes took their stories into the Near East, and some then went off to become Indo-Europeans, and then later they then traded with them, and we see that all the time. We see it with Greece, we see it with India, and that's how myths spread and change and adapt as well.
So this mythology, if we can call, from both Mesopotamia, Proto-Indo-European, it spans to post-history and prehistory here, and we see this having common source. Who is the daddy or the mommy of this mythology, and can we trace that back? Can we go further back in time?
That is tough, and it's tough for a couple of reasons. One, because if you believe in a religion and it's your life, you don't tend to write it down because it's a day-to-day thing. Okay, so there isn't much written down about the rituals that happened and the like pre-literature. It wasn't a big thing. The Rig Veda, we got some, and maybe in the Near East, but certainly Christianity didn't write down anything about the many cultures, religions, and rituals when they started to colonize the world, when Christians colonized the world. So we don't have it from that point of view. And also we actually see, certainly before agricultural development, the gods weren't personified. They weren't. You very rarely had figures of gods. Now we get the Venus women from 30,000 years ago or so. But in terms of having god shapes like you see of Zeus or Venus or Jesus, those sort of things didn't really happen until sort of far later. And in fact, even let's say the Nordic gods, so the Vikings, think of them, they didn't really personify their gods until maybe 700 or 800 CE. So 1300 years ago. That's only when they started making it. And we see that because if you find a temple, there are no statues in it. Yeah, they just don't have these figures. And so because there's no figures, it's really hard to say what are they. So we tend to believe that the gods of sort of 6,000 years and older were probably more in spiritual form, which aligns to an animist view, which is that if something moves, it's probably got a spirit.
Like water. Water has a spirit.
Yeah. And the moon stream. And the sun and the wind, and storms and clouds. And that's why storm gods became really important. Because you had, so in Indo-European, you had a sky father, and I believe in the agricultural world, you would have had an earth mother, who they sort of the equivalent of the chief god. But then you find that the storm god really persists and often takes over the role of the sky father in many religions. We see it in the Abrahamic religion. I believe Yahweh at one point was a storm god before getting his role, but we see it in Indra became the chief of the gods. You see that Marduk became chief of the gods. So we just see that, and I guess that's because of the power they actually felt from the things moving.
It's interesting that you point out that it's funny how the evolution of God takes place, where people then later are having too much time on their hands. They start to philosophize these ideas, and they go, well, God must be an unmoved mover. So now everything that moves, right, is like in ancient times, it's divine. But then like there's got to be something that doesn't move that causes all things to move. That just always was, right? And it's funny how that evolution happens. But I don't want to get caught up on that. I just wanted to emphasize, like,
yes, but that's a far more modern thing, and you do find a lot of medieval thoughts and onwards, and modern thoughts actually influence our current day thoughts so much that we think they're really old thoughts because they're so ingrained in us. Now we think Vikings wear horned helmets, but they never did. Yeah, that was a 19th century opera.
Big horn helmets.
But you see these things, you just think that is the way it was, and they're sort of like modern day myths almost. You have these little bits of what we think are truths, which aren't.
I think it's pretty interesting you talk about they weren't personified. And I don't know about you, but I've been caught out in storms, especially when I worked in construction. We had nowhere to get into a building, and we've had lightning strike 80 feet. I'm talking not just like a little lightning, like thunderstorm level, like intense, where you feel your life flashes literally before your eyes. And you feel like that was my life. I almost died just now.
The power. If you're that close to the power.
I don't care how naturalist you are. I don't care if I don't think there's really anything out there. If I have the time, I'm sitting in a comfortable area and I'm thinking about it and I go, you know what? I think it's a natural phenomena. when you are experiencing it, the power of it is so much beyond you being a human that you can't help. And I can only imagine in a pre-scientific world, right?
Exactly.
You can't
the
help
noise, a big thunderstorm, that lightning, and it sets fire to things. It's yeah, absolutely. It's
you're assuming it's out to get me. And I remember someone mentioning the chimpanzees in Africa when lightning struck, a thunderclap hit, and they shook their fist up at the sky because even chimps, right, recognize, they think it's coming after me, and it assumes there's agency.
wow.
But we would say it's a natural phenomena today. But in those days, you would imagine this is something out to get you, and it helps you survive. This is why, like, we're at this crossroad, in my opinion, in your thinking here in mythology. I couldn't prove all of this, but taking a naturalist approach, we're at this crossroad where I think religion was an evolutionary product of survival, and how the observation of the world and what becomes world religions. There's like this crossroad I think is happening.
Okay. Yeah. So I believe that myth begot religion. So myth drove religion. So religion is all myth to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so so myths are created out of evolution because you've got to create a reason why bad things are happening or good things are happening. And then someone wants to say, well, it can't just happen out of nothing. Something's got to make it happen. Right. So let's create a god and call him Bob and put him in the sky, and there we go. We give money to a man every Sunday who's obviously looking after Bob for us, and obviously that's religion, modern day religion.
I just think that was like the development. Even another thing that we do as humans is we tell stories. And
that is our differentiator to pretty much any other animal, is that we tell stories.
Have you ever, and this is, look, I'm over here asking personal questions of John, but I'm going to admit, let me make you feel comfortable. I've done this. So I'm going to ask you if you've ever done this. You go out and you do some hard labor, or you accomplish something great. And when you tell the next person or people the story, you exaggerate. I mean, you do it on the spot. It's not like you had I had motives from the get-go to make up something. I'm telling you the story and people are enjoying what I'm saying, and I end up adding details, or I emphasize, or I elaborate, or I exaggerate. It's totally normal and expected, actually.
It is. So, and it's a psychological thing, and magicians rely on it. So, for example, if you see a magician do a trick, you'll go away thinking, oh, he never touched the cards, or he never shuffled them. But he probably did. But you want to believe the magic. And it's human psychology to add things and take things away to fit the picture you want. Because at the end of the day, and this is going a bit deep, what you're seeing in the world is a simulation, in the sense that not the world is a simulation, but it's going into your brain, and your brain is making that picture. So you're not seeing exactly what your eyes see. Your brain is forming the picture of what you're seeing, and therefore it can do whatever it wants with that picture. That's what happens. I think that's
well put. That. Yeah, and I think this is myth making in the process, or at least storytelling that might be combining itself with myth making, especially if you're a king or a leader of a people and you want to emphasize that guy, he accomplished the mighty deeds of da 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 da, and later on they end up doing that. I do have a super chat here. I really appreciate super chats. Thank you so much, everybody who supports us here at MythVision. The great civilizations model is flawed and prejudicial. Mesopotamian scholars probably wrote down stories that belonged to all humanity.
So by the time Mesopotamia happened, people were pretty much all over the world: Australia, South America, North America, Europe. So are they saying that the Mesopotamian writing down stories that all of those people knew? Because I'm pretty sure those stories had developed in those other places. I would say that in Mesopotamia, certainly some of the stories seem to be very rooted in some of the oldest motifs we know, such as the splitting of Tiamat, which is in effect analogous to an egg splitting, and that's one of the major creation myths. So we see that. The water serpent we know comes from a very early myth, and that comes from South Africa. We've got that dated to probably, conservatively 70,000, but it's probably near 100 to 130,000 years old, based on how we see human dispersal. So, most big myths we know today that have persisted probably have some very, very old roots, but the stories themselves wouldn't be exactly the same all over the world, not at all.
I like this. And I think in that question for the super chatter, what I think really I'd like to give them benefit of the doubt is here it says that it's belonged to all humanity. And I think in all of these creation myths that we're reading, there is this universal aspect to man. Typically what I notice happening, at least in the biblical case, right, is you have this story, right, about man. I've seen some people try to argue Adam is like just like one little subgroup, and like there's other men and stuff, and there are other people out there and things like that. And they go to like, well, who was Cain afraid of? The story doesn't tell us where these other people come from, right? But, and good point, but like once you realize these are multiple sources that are being spliced together, and really it's about one guy, all the people. Now they weren't thinking genetics and inbred and like incest and all that kind of stuff. They weren't really thinking about all these things we think about today, but like it is a universal picture. But the point of the whole myth is to kind of paint how their civilization, how God ended up choosing their group. Right. So while it's universal to show you how they were chosen among all the people groups. And the same probably goes for Mesopotamia, right? And other.
Absolutely. Is their truth. And that's what a myth really is. We've discussed this before the show, that a myth has a truth that the tradition or the tribe or society believe, and that's what makes it persist, which is very different to a story you tell down the pub and you know, which can get exaggerated and changed, and you know 5 weeks later someone else tells you the same story back but it's changed, you don't even recognize it. And that's the difference. So yes, I certainly believe to them they were writing stories as though it was for humanity's sake. Absolutely, because that's why you wrote them down, so other people would see. Certainly when writing was new, I mean, writing was almost magical. You know, some people thought there was power in the writing of this, but we also lost something, and that this is not to be really underestimated. And it's something I'm really quite passionate about, which is we started to lose the ability to tell stories as a person, individually. So we have a show, or we had a show, I don't know if it's still going, in England called Jack and Oi. So when you got home from school, there was someone sitting in a chair reading from a book, a story. And it was on for 10 minutes. And it was the most boring 10 minutes of my life, watching someone read a story. But if there was someone there acting out the story, telling the story, almost in a monologue, but that you'd listen to that more readily.
Right.
And as soon as writing started to happen, I think we started to lose some of that. And we also managed to get a lot more mistranslations.
You're touching something powerful here. There's a book, shoot, I should pull this up for people who are interested. Actually, I'm going to. So there's a scholar, while I'm pulling up Amazon, named John Knight Lundwall. I don't know if you've ever heard of John Knight Lundwall. I'm going to pull up his book. He wrote a book. Let me do this. I'm going to share my screen here. And it's actually a very good book. I've interviewed him in the past. I plan, you know what, this makes me want to re-spark that interview. Mythos and Cosmos, Mind and Meaning in the Oral Age. He has gone into these mythologies. So I'll read it. A bold new approach to myth studies, Mythos and Cosmos, re-examines ancient myth through the template of oral thinking and oral cosmology, contradicting decades of assumptions about the purpose and function of ancient mythology. Lundwall defines myth as the oral imprinting press of pre-literate peoples and shows that myth belongs to a complex and rational method of information transmission amongst oral peoples. Further, ancient mythology belonged to a cultus which incorporated ritual and symbol in a cosmological system which sought to found the sacred world. Where this work really shines is in its discussion of how ancient oral peoples saw their universe. Oral cosmology is far more complex than the simple flat earth models discussed in current textbooks. Such myth cycles as the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Labors of Hercules, and the story of the Great Flood are seen completely different when viewed from within ancient cosmological thought. Many strange features of ancient culture, such as the dancing chorus in Greek theater, are explained in rational and revolutionary ways. The pyramids, ziggurats, and megalithic hinges are also seen in a new light. While academic, the book is written for a general audience. It is fascinating exploration in ancient history, comparative myth, and religious studies in the ancient mind. And long story short, to sum up what he's gone on my channel saying, you may not agree with everything that's mentioned there, but what I've had him come on and say is that these texts that we're seeing have a fossil of what you mentioned about acting out. So they literally would not just, all right, we're reading Genesis 1 again, like the Jewish people do today. They're reading Torah, they're acting, they're doing a dance or a song to this.
It was a ritual. It's often a ritual. Yeah, absolutely. It's very important. And that made people want to listen and the setting to be right. And absolutely. Because to do that, and because many of these stories were poetic, not necessarily in the way we consider poetry, but there's a lot of alliteration or sort of words of similar length. It was easier to remember. It wasn't just prose. It wasn't just telling the story we tell today. So it's a lot. People basically singing very long songs, for half an hour, and you would remember it after listening to it for 10 years or so. Right. Absolutely. But yes, that's what I miss. And some of my I've got some really good friends who've done PhDs in storytelling, and to watch them tell stories is a totally different experience. It's almost like watching a play or about with one person get really touching on it. It's just, I would recommend anyone to try and go and support a storyteller, because they're probably having a really bad career choice, to be honest. Anything about myths and folk tales isn't really gets paid well, not even in academia or anything. So support your local storyteller, but make sure they're not just reading a book. They're using their hands and telling the story.
Yeah, man, I think that you're onto something. So Mesopotamian mythology for a second. I've had Dr. Joshua Bowen. He's an Assyriologist. And he said that there's an older story, or it looks like there's a story right before the one of Tiamat. And I don't know if chronologically speaking, Tiamat maybe it's a split off of two different traditions, but there's one about a bird. And I can't remember the name of that bird.
Yes, I can't remember the bird. And because you got I want to say Aniku or something, but I can tell you the origin of that story, because that story is a creation myth that turned into the flood myth. Yes.
And that bird has like the powers, or it takes the tablets of destiny or something like that.
Yes, if you look for pictures of Tiamat, you often get a picture of this bird come up, and everybody thinks it's Tiamat, but it's not. It's the bird. It's just like, it looks human shaped, but with a beak, but dragon sort of fingers. And so that's a really interesting piece of myth. So So the very earliest stories we have of creation, we believe that people lived underground and they came onto the earth through a tree. Okay, and that has a lot of motifs around it and links to the tree of life, and we can talk about that in a minute. And so these people out, but we see that myth change, and that myth changes into what we call the earth diver myth. So this is when we start seeing the story that there was void in the beginning, and the world was sea, and the void pressed against the sea, and the sea became salty and chaotic. And then out of this salty, chaotic sea came either a human or an animal. And this animal then dived down from the surface of the sea to the bottom of the sea, because there was a bottom of the sea, which is a bit weird because it's just a chaos, but they had to be there. That's how myths work. Got some soil from the bottom of the sea, brought it to the surface, and that turned into land, and it expanded. And that's how land was created, and people landed on the land, and you got with the big snake, and humans existed. Now, this, what we call the earth diver myth of this bird, sometimes going down, getting earth and coming back, that was a creation myth until it got to China about 50,000 years ago. And that's where the flood myth was created in China. Well, that's where all our research suggests the flood myth came from. And that's probably because the flooding of the islands from Southeast Asia, of the islands going down to Australia, occurred. So sea levels were low at 50,000 years ago or 60,000 years ago. They obviously raised a bit, all that land. You could literally walk from China almost to Australia. But then the sea levels rise and you get Indonesia and the Philippines and all those islands. So we believe that's probably the influence of the flood myth, nothing to do with the Younger Dryas period or anything like that, although they probably helped reinforce the story. So what happened at that point is the bird that dived to the sea became a bird that, when they couldn't find land because they were flooded, they let go, say, find some land. And the bird came back with a bit of mud, and with the mud, land was created. And that journeyed back into the Near East, turned into Noah. And so when he's at sea with no land, he lets go of a dove, goes off, comes back with a branch. Noah gets a dove pie. Knows land is coming. Life is good.
I was just about to say, a lot of people, when they read Genesis 1, using critical scholarship as a method, we see a connection between Genesis 1, this sequence up to the seventh resting day, and the Genesis 6, 7 with the flood of Noah, where we see there's definitely a correlation in the narrative where this is the flood, but Genesis 1 sounds kind of like a flood. So you kind of look at Genesis 1, and while it is a creation myth, it's like there's waters, it's flood in the earth, and then finally land appears, things like that. It sounds like a flood in a way. So there's a creation myth in this Noah story, but it's also a creation myth in Genesis 1 that has this connection.
So the Genesis 1 myth of the world being sea, coming from the Mesopotamian, is a direct relation of the early creation myth. And then the flood myth is a development based from China, and it came back, and that's because of the dragon motif as well. So the dragon turned from being a benevolent dragon that created the world with water and turned into a dragon in the sky that made it rain, because obviously it must have rained a lot for the sea levels to rise and the like. I mean, obviously there was glacial melting and ice cap melting, but there would have probably been a lot of that, and then people associated with that, and then that's how you get these myths sort of splitting, but still remaining within the tradition. So you then get those two motifs. In fact, I think there's two, isn't there? Two lots of Noah myths in Genesis, isn't it? Sort of repeated the flood myth. It's not the flood myth repeated twice in Genesis.
According to scholars, there's two narratives that have been
together. Well, you just see that. And the same with Adam and Eve. In effect, the creation of humans there's two. And one of them, the rib taking, is in effect like the splitting of a body. And some people actually translate it as that, which is again from the Tiamat egg tradition.
And so, in the Greek mythology, it really is a male-female human that is split in half to become the two sexes.
Exactly. And in Indo-European, so early in European, so Scandinavia, Ymir is an androgyny, so he's man and woman.
Right.
And he's called Ymir, so it means twin. So he's one body meaning twin that splits into two. So all linked. Absolutely amazing, isn't it? It's just.
We do have a super chat, and I want to get that here in just a second, but I want to mention, you talk about the Earth Diver, and I've actually never really delved into this, but it reminded me of what I heard from Native American mythology, that men came out of the ground. And we do see this even in biblical mythology with dirt made from the ground, right? Like this idea. So can you give us a little bit more on that before we get to our super chat of like, what is trying to be said here, or what is the Earth Diver myth? I've never heard anyone explain into detail what that is.
Okay, so if we go back a bit, so the fact is the Earth had to be created some way, and people were used to seeing a lot of water. Obviously the sea, feels like people spend a lot of time by the sea, so they see water everywhere, and we're on a bit of land. How did that come up from the sea? So their logic was the sea didn't fill land, the land came up from the sea. So they had that mentality.
Okay.
And so they had to think, well, how is that created? And actually, there is a view that one of the very earliest creation myths is that man excreted land out of himself. So because in a primitive mind, where does that excretion come from? It's just nothing. So if you're creating something from nothing, then did we build land like that? And that's, and obviously the myth then changes into, well, perhaps we came from the earth, or you get this Earth diver myth. So it's a process that we had to be created from something, and the only material around us, what have we got? And Earth is the family-friendly version of that. Now, as I say, and because the earliest myth we really know is that people lived underground and caused earthquakes and the like, because they were living underground. And then when they could find a tree to climb up through and get onto the world, this tree of life, so to speak, which is really common. That's when the myth started to change. I mean, that went off in a different direction, and the creation myth became the Earth Diver myth.
Few things. We've heard of titans causing earthquakes. They're stumbling in the dark underneath the earth. Is this a remnant, you think, left over?
Sort of. So titans and giants in general are, I feel they are a myth that allows a tradition to explain a previous tradition's actions normally. So I see, and this is really actually apt for Indo-European people trying to explain what agricultural people did. So the agricultural people in Western Europe built lots of stone monuments, for example, big stone monuments, with stones weighing tons and tons and tons. If you're an Indo-European, you come along and you haven't the same rituals and culture and traditions of the agricultural people, and you see these big stones, who put them there?
Exactly. I'm with you on that. That's my understanding.
Yeah.
And maybe those people who originally built them were a pretty large civilization and they became nomadic because they had to follow the food. So now you have these other civilizations that come centuries later and they go, how the hell did this get made?
Exactly.
Only massive giants could have made this big.
And you see that, and there's evidence around this. And this is actually one of the things I saw about. I mean, you made a video with Gnostic Informant about, I think you talked about the Earth Mother, and I can't remember which one it was. It wasn't Demeter, maybe, but it made me make a video about Demeter, which is that Demeter is a sort of this Earth Mother type god in Greek mythology. But if you actually look, she isn't an Olympian. She's got all the power she should have, but she's actually been demoted. And you actually realise, actually, she's an agricultural god from the agricultural beliefs and traditions that has remained. But because you're so powerful, she remains, whilst the Indo-European gods come in, and you find that Zeus isn't a typical sky father figure, which is what his name would represent. He's a supreme being. He isn't just a god. He has superpowers. And so it looks like he's taken some of her, which is this Earth Mother kind of power she would have had, and taken it for himself. And you start seeing this, and then you see it in other cultures. You see it in, again, the Nordic cultures where you have the Aesir with people like Odin and Thor. But then there's a set of gods in the Nordic culture called the Vanir, and they're all agricultural. And you start thinking, why are the gods split between these sort of Indo-European-esque gods and these agricultural gods? And you realise what we're actually seeing is a real-life archaeology of myth still there, and it hasn't completely covered up the previous traditions and the previous religions, and that's what's going on.
That I love this, and I do. And there's so much to explore on this. Ma and Pa Ferguson, thank you for that super chat. I really appreciate that. Was the use of red ochre in Mesolithic graves a worldwide tradition?
It wasn't used everywhere. It certainly was considered magical. If you applied it, there was something you wanted to happen to what you're applying to from. So we do see that, and graves are an interesting feature anyway. So as soon as people started to be buried in graves, then you start thinking, actually, the people who buried them must think something's going to happen to that body. So that's the time when people go from you're dead to, oh no, perhaps you're not dead and I'm doing something else. So let's be honest, it could also mean that by burying a body, you stop it getting eaten by animals, and it's a safe thing. But if someone puts a grave good in or does something with the body, such as put red ochre on it, or leave a weapon in there, then they're thinking there's something else going on. And that's our first indication that we see this happening. And we actually see some of this in, I think it's in Israel, around 120, 130,000 years ago. We see the first burials of adults. So there's already some thinking there. We think they're burials. We're 50-50 on it, because there's some indications to suggest that the graves are contaminated or may have been luckily buried and the like. So there's a book by Professor Alice, forgot her surname, a British professor who's written a book called Ancestors, which I think talks about that specifically. It's worth a read. Alice Roberts, I think it is. But that's quite interesting, because that then starts the journey into actually what happens when we die. So I talked about, we thought we were immortal, something happened, then we died, but then we start seeing a belief in something else.
I want to dig into that, actually, since the super chat, thank you again for the support,
thanks.
has brought up life and death. There's a book. This is late in terms of Greek, when the Greeks ruled the world, or at least even before Greeks, in this, in between 1000 BCE down into the time of the first century, the Common Era, you see a lot of ancestor worship, and the boundaries between life and death are not fixed. There is no black and white. It isn't our our papa died, and that's it. We're gonna go say bye to him at the funeral. Like, they brought food. They continue to bring food. They would continue to bring goods. They continue to bring water to the dead person, in believing they're still around. They're still alive somehow, and they're eating or drinking. And even today, I've seen actually, they call it SE. What is it? Where they're asking questions, Christians and atheists, who are like trying to have these conversations about what they believe. I can't think right now. Anyway, scratch that part, but they asked this one girl, and she talked about her grandmother told her to leave a cup of water out on the windowsill because, the grandmother would come and the spirit would lick the water because they're thirsty. And I'm thinking to myself, this is weird. Like, we find this weird thing even in the little legend of Lazarus and the rich man. Like please just touch your finger, and they're thirsty. They're thirsty in this place in Hades, if you will, Hades. Like, what is going on here? And I thought, man, this is interesting to get into, because there's another book, I'm hoping the scholar will respond to me, where she talks about the ancestor cult of worship in ancient Israel, which leads me into another academic I recently interviewed, Daniel McClellan, who wrote a book called Yahweh's Divine Images. And I asked him a question in an interview, and I said, Dr. McClellan, do you think that Yahweh might have been a man of a tribe somewhere in the south, in Western Asia, right there in the Middle East, that he might have been a man that was deified at some point, because it was not uncommon for men to become gods and to get the attributes? He goes, Derek, you won't believe this, but during my dissertation, I brought this to my professors. They looked at me and said, I can't believe you're actually presenting this during your dissertation as if this is some ancient euhemerization taking place, that Yahweh might have just been a tribal leader who was a warrior. Notice he's a war god. And that doesn't prove anything. It's just interesting to think. Here's this tribal leader who becomes God. And I thought, what kind of practical joke would it be that Christians today, right, not realizing their God was once a human being, Mormons actually are closer to the truth, if that were the case, that their God was once a man who took on the attributes of a storm deity and became something like that. Anyway, I just went from burial, funeral, they're not completely dead, to deification. And in fact, he makes the point that at tombstones and all of that, and standing stones for deities, temples are technically big funeral homes or houses where the gods live, just like your loved one lives in a house when they're buried. So it's like, what's going on? Is there a correlation between the temples and funerals? I don't know. So I'm going to shut up and let you ramble, man.
So there's a lot to unpack there. So the general belief is that when you died, you didn't die. Okay. So, and you couldn't die in the real world. You could only die in the other world. Okay. So if you're still alive in the other world, that's why it makes sense to leave food out and to act as though you are alive. So in effect, you are still immortal, but you're not really immortal because you are dead biologically. So meaning to upset anybody here, but that's what can happen. So you have this view. So, and that persisted for a while, that when you die, you enter the other world. And the other world, I believe, was probably partly created from looking in reflections of water and things like that, where you see yourself like an opposite of yourself down there. And we actually see descriptions of the other world are quite consistent, saying, and because people think heaven's paradise, okay, but the other world isn't paradise. It just sounds like paradise, because you don't want for anything. You don't want for food. You don't want for warmth. You don't want for time. You don't want for sunlight, but you don't want for cold, and you don't want for hunger or whatever. It basically is an absence of everything in the other world. It's literally a void, which is why you don't want anything. And there's stories about people going to the other world or going to a magical island that represents the other world for a day, but when they come back, they've been there 20 years. And you see this sort of thing happening. And this is a very certainly a very common theme in Indo-European mythology. And we see they talk about this world being a real place, this other world being a real tangible place, often to the east, sometimes to the south. And we see the Vikings write about it, saying it was actually the other side of India. So it's a long way away, and this is where people went. And this is interesting because this place was ruled by the lord of the underworld, the king of the underworld. So who was the king of the underworld? Well, the king, so when Manu and Yemo came along, Manu was considered a priest and Yemo the king. So when Yemo was sacrificed, he persisted being king, but he became king of the other world. So before there was a devil or a representation of personification of the grave or such like, there's this Yima or Yama or Yemo was the lord of the underworld. And we see this persisting in Vedic culture and Persian culture. They often are described to have these places that are sometimes palaces, but where you want for nothing.
This is good stuff, by the way. Pay attention. This is good, everybody.
Okay, so we see that happening. Then what you see develop from that is that how do people get to this land when you die? And so we see another piece of mythology come along, which we often associate in Greek mythology as the ferryman of the dead. So you go on a journey to this other world, but you have to cross a river. That's pretty key. And when you originally died, you just went to the other world. But there was no judgment. But what we start seeing around 4,000 years ago or so, that in Persia, they started to put something in the way of that. And this was called the Sinvat Bridge in Persian mythology or Zoroastrianism. So you had to cross this bridge rather than a ferryman. And then we start seeing it develop that on that bridge there's judgment, or the ferryman asks for money or things like that. And that piece of mythology we know is being told in North America by First Nation Americans and in Eurasia. So that's got to be at least 20,000 years old, because it couldn't have got to North America any other way other than before the last glacial maximum when you could cross the Bering Strait. So you see this link of this otherworld imagery along with the journey to the otherworld imagery. And then what we also see is that you get the personification of the grave happening. So when you die, people then start applying, someone takes you from your grave to the other world. And so the first god, it was a goddess who did that, was called Kylo the Coverer in Indo-European, and she turns into hell in Scandinavian. So that's the equivalent of the devil in effect. That is the person who rules the horrible bit of the underworld, I guess you'd call it, the bad bit. She also Calypso she evolves into the Greek Calypso nymph for some reason. But we see that. So we see all these things coming together. And so this judgment changes. And so we see, say, the Sinvat Bridge in Persia, but in India, the judgment goes so far as that even if you've lived a good life, if the people preparing your body, if one of them has committed a sin, then that is applied to you when they bury you. And so you never get to go to the other world. So it has to be a really pure sort of process. And then on top of all that, if we're talking about death, if we can go off a slight tangent here, we can talk about dogs. So what we find is that in certain Persian rituals, and I think it happens in India occasionally too, they have rituals of the dog. And they call it like the eyes of the dog. And sometimes they paint extra eyes on the dog, so it's got 4 eyes. But usually the dogs are in pairs. So in Greek mythology, you get the 3-headed dog, whose name escapes me, which is really rubbish.
Cerberus, yeah.
Cerberus. A 3-headed dog, but that's really just a clashing of 2 dogs put together, and they just added another head. But it's really just 2 dogs, like a black dog and a white dog. And what that is that one dog is meant to live in the real world, and one dog lives in the other world. And so when someone dies, the ritual is the polite ritual is you leave a place on the meal table at the wake, in effect, for a dog to come along and eat the meal, and you treat them right. But actually what happened is that dog was allowed to eat the body of the dead person. And if a dog wasn't there, you'd allow birds to eat it. And the reason for that is that people believed that dogs and birds had the ability to traverse realms. So they could go from our world into the underworld. So if a dog ate your body, it could carry you into the other world. And that's how you got transported. And that's why you then get dogs guarding the underworld in these stories like Kerberos. And you have to give them treats to get past it. They're not impossible to bypass. And it's normally you give them a bit of food. So, and then if you then take that further, that implies why gods of death have dogs and birds with them. Think of Hermes or Mercury or Odin. They all have dogs and birds because they are the animals that allow the passing of bodies to the other world. They can cross realms. So there you go. That's why long we talked to your long question.
No, this is so, and I guarantee you could have gone twice as long because there's so much I said. And someone corrected me in the chat. It isn't euhemerization. Sorry, it was deification. I reversed that on accident. I think euhemerization came to mind just because
changing a fictional person into a real person rather than a real person into.
I just got it backwards, but yeah,
I knew what you meant.
Yeah, you knew, and I'm glad they pointed it out because I am wanting people who are listening to learn this. Real quick, shout out the Atheist Pastor. Thank you for becoming a member of MythVision. You rock. You will obviously get access to anything that I'm launching on the Patreon that is like early bird specials, stuff like that. Notice I said bird because it travels to the Patreon and brings things to the Patreon realm. Yes, but thank you for supporting the channel, and hope that you enjoy being a member and having that special badge next to your name during our live streams. Bradford Baldwin was like reminding me SE that I said and I couldn't remember is street epistemology. And that's exactly right. Thank you for that super chat. That's what I was trying to get at.
Smart chat there, Derek.
I know, right? We got a lot of people who actually do listen, and that's what I appreciate about our audience. Oftentimes they know more than I do, or they'll say something that I've never really thought about, something like that. You said a lot there. There's a lot of really interesting things that you've discussed, from Cerberus to the dog and the birds. I also, talking about this death situation and afterlife. You mentioned in passing that Persia still had this underworld ruler of the underworld and things like this. And I thought about it. I was like, if you go back into the Hebrew Bible, you don't really find, as a lot of the scholars say, there's no like afterlife existence. It's like this shadowy existence. They don't really go into Sheol, the grave. They don't really go into much of it, according to scholars. They're like, I don't really see much happening.
Wasn't it when Cyrus took over the empire? I think wasn't that influenced, the Zoroastrian influence on the Abrahamic religion at the time, then allowed them thinking, oh, they've got a heaven and a hell, we'll have one of those.
Right.
Because that's what people do. I think that's where that came from.
This might be why we start seeing this tradition of the devil or Satan being
exactly
the bad
appears,
guy.
and that's
dualism.
That is the personification of grave. Yeah, and we see. So one of the things to reinforce that in the personification of the grave is that Oedipus, I think it is, the guy who in Greek mythology who can play anything. He's quite a talented musician. There's a story about him where his wife is killed by a snake. And she goes to the other world, and he's heartbroken, and he wants her back. So he plays his lyre or whatever musical instrument he's got, probably a Gibson electric guitar, something metal. Anyway, the ferryman of the dead thinks, well, you play that well, I'm going to give you a free trip into the other world. He goes there, plays again for Hades, and says, can I take my wife home? She didn't deserve to die. And he goes, yes, you can take her home, but on one condition, that you don't look back at her when you leave. If you look back, she'll be pulled back in. But if you don't look back, she'll come out with you. So he goes, thanks, mate. Off I go. And as he's about to leave the underworld, he peeks over his shoulder to make sure his wife's there. She goes. And then he's heartbroken. So that's a particular story. The First Nation Americans, I think it's both the Sioux and the Iroquois, they're called Iroquois. They both have the same story with a man whose wife gets killed, goes to the underworld. He fails to bring her back because he fails a test. And then it's normally that he then gets bitten by a snake and dies to join her.
Wow.
And that's why and because of those real similarities, along with a few other things about motifs, and they're like, we are very confident that that's why the ferryman of the dead myth, because they talk about a journey to go to the underworld over a river through this, have a single source.
This is a leap, but it makes me think of Romeo and Juliet. in a way.
What a story. What a story.
Yeah, it makes me think of that. I don't know if that leap, there's a connection there, but I definitely think of Lot and his wife in Sodom and Gomorrah.
There's some of those. They're not quite the same. It's a bit like Cain and Abel. People think Cain and Abel are like the divine twins, but they're not, although they're quite similar in some respects. But no, they really aren't.
I thought of Cain and Abel like Romulus and Remus in a way. I thought of them in some... and I could be mistaken here because it doesn't say they're twins, but I think of like the two brothers that are trying and
isn't it pastoral versus agricultural farming? Because the Bible has this thing that the agricultural people are great and the pastoral people are rubbish. That's really a theme that I'm probably summarising it because I'm not really a biblical scholar. But that is in effect a reflex of the rest of the world, where it was the pastoral farmers who overtook the agricultural farmers, and perhaps it's that, because that's how the Indo-Europeans really spread so much. Perhaps it's part of that influenced that thought that people who are pastoral farmers, aren't nice people, so we'll remain in our tradition of agricultural farming.
I think the Bible, at least in the Jacob and Jacob and Esau story. Esau's the hunter-gatherer, so to speak, the hairy, hardcore, I'm going to go and hunt my food. Jacob is the pastoral farmer, and it actually encourages the pastoral farmer in that narrative, and it kind of makes the other look bad. So it's really the shepherd, and you see this over and over throughout the Bible. Yeah. The shepherd is the good guy. In fact, as I was reading about Muhammad and like the legends that are added to the prophet Muhammad, after his death and he's long gone, is many of the biographies start to paint a picture of him as a shepherd instead of a merchant. They didn't like the idea of him being a merchant for two reasons. They don't want him to have left Arabia. Where did he get these ideas? Number two is that they want him to look like the prophets from the biblical tell. So he has to be a shepherd, and they see this as some good thing, that they're shepherds of a flock, of a herd, like King David, like Moses, like Jacob, and things like that. So I wonder if that transition's taking place biblically at some point where the shepherd looks good. And if you look, Abel sacrifices an actual animal, so he is a shepherd. Cain is the agricultural one who's trying to
yes, I think you're right there. I got that wrong way, but absolutely, you see that, and that's quite different. So the divine twins in Indo-European are a warrior and a provider. And I'll go off into another bit of mythology then to explain this. So
we're all over the place.
So we go back to our friend Jimo, who Lord of the Underworld. Well, when he gets killed, Manu, his brother, his twin, makes the world from his body. Yeah, but he also makes people from what's left over of Yimo's body. Okay, because he's a big gianty kind of guy. So he makes, out of the heads, he makes priests. Out of the torso, he makes warriors. And out of the legs, he makes providers. So in effect, you've got priests, warriors, and farmers. In effect, that are made from the body. But he has enough material from the legs, torso, and head to make a king. And this is, so there's two ways we can go here. So to touch on a king briefly, the king is a king because he's made from all the pieces of the other people. He understands them. So he can understand what a farmer wants and what a priest wants and what a warrior wants, because he's made from those parts of the body, which also then says, because he's made from the same body that's made the land, he's also in touch with the land. So if the land is well, the king is well. And then if the king gets injured or hurt or loses his arm, then the land starts getting ill because the king's ill, and he's no longer considered fit to be king because he can't understand some of his people. And that's a really common myth. We see that in things like King Arthur, but there's other myths as well. But I sort of said that because of divine twins. So the divine twins tend to be, one of them tends to be a warrior and the other one tends to be a farmer. And so you get this, is it Pastor and Pollux and Castor? You get them in Greece and Rome. You get Hengist and Horsa in the Germanic mythology. And what you'll find is that the weaker one disappears. The farmer actually disappears, and you're just left with the other. So I think was it Pollux who then became the patron saint of the Roman legions, and it's Hengist who remains the conqueror of England because Horsa disappears and Castle disappears. So you see this, and so in a way it's a similar-esque story to Cain and Abel, but rather than shepherds and an agricultural farmer, it is a warrior and a farmer.
Wow, there's so much here. I saw a question in passing in the chat a while back, because the title of this is The Oldest Myths and Stories in the World. What would you say is, as far as we can tell, there's no way to prove without a shadow of doubt.
We use statistical significance, yes.
What would statistical significance tell us about the oldest? What story is the oldest that you have figured out?
Right, so a myth is made up of motifs. It's made up of mythemes. So mythemes being a set of words, a motif being a sort of a subplot, and the myth being a collection of all these together. So to know the oldest myth, we need to know pretty much the whole story. And the oldest one that I am aware of that we can prove with some statistical significance is the Cosmic Hunt, which I have to be said very carefully on American YouTube, because my British accent makes those words combine into something rude.
I've seen. No, I get it. And by the way, I love the hunt in the game that I play.
Oh, right, okay.
That I think I mentioned to you before. There's a game that actually
Assassin's Creed or something, isn't it? I think.
It's called. Now I can't even think about it.
It's not Assassin's Creed. It's one of the. Oh, is it Witcher?
Witcher, yeah. There's a whole show right now about this. But
there is, yes.
The Hunt.
A disappointing show, I must admit. Because anyway, that's a different topic. So where were we going with this? I've lost our track.
The Hunt. You were saying.
The Hunt.
Yeah.
Statistically speaking, the Cosmic Hunt, which is a story about hunter-gatherers going off to capture an animal that has stolen the sun, or it's called the sun in their antlers if it's a deer or something, and they kill the sun and the sun's released. And the reason we know this is the oldest story is because it's based on a set of stars, Ursa Major, or the Plough, or the Dipper, which most people are familiar with. The sky looks like a saucepan. Now, before writings and before there's any sort of charts, people didn't always have the same constellations. Groups of stars were groups of stars. But we actually find that from the Inuits to people like the First Nation Americans to Europeans, people in Siberia, they all tell this story, but they all tell the story with exactly the same stars and doing exactly the same things. And that's what makes it, makes us really confident. But the real kick, well, there's a few kickers. One is that, let's say in Europe, they talk about a deer. In Siberia, they talk about a mammoth taking the sun. In the North America, I think they talk about a bear stealing the sun. And when the bear's killed, its blood sprays the leaves of the trees, which is why autumn comes and they all turn brown. But this star, so part of the story is at the end of the day, the animal dies and it falls into the ground and disappears. Well, if it's based on Ursa Major, and you look at Ursa Major today, Ursa Major doesn't go near the ground, so that doesn't make sense. Normally, those cosmological stories would reflect the actual movement of the stars. And so if Ursa Major's in the sky, we couldn't work that out. But using sort of astronomical tools, if we turn the Earth back 30,000 years, Ursa Major, because the way the Earth moves, actually goes under the horizon, the Northern Hemisphere, in the winter. And it's like, they were telling the story about Ursa Major. And so that the Cosmic Hunt is the oldest story we know, sort of from end to end. It's not a complex story. But we believe that's 30 to 40,000 years old. But some of the motifs we've talked about today are certainly 70 to possibly 100 to 130,000 years old. I mean, after 70,000 years, it's really difficult. You can only just assume because of speed of dispersal and other stories and how old it is. But anything younger than 70,000 years, we can date a lot more easily because we know, for example, the people who came into America, North America, were eventually pushed down into South America by a second influx, and they then were then pushed down by a third influx. So where we see separate stories and separate DNA evidence, so we use DNA to help track our dispersals, we can see like different age and different groups of settings of stories that have moved with dispersals. And it's all that data together with understanding the words being used that gives us the statistics to understand if something is probable or not.
Okay, this I think is worthy of getting into about stars. It's a very significant thing even today. in a scientific age. We have people reading their astronomy. They're born and they're Leo or they're
Astrology,
Gemini,
yes.
right. And I know that this goes way back. People are born. Usually you'd look at the birth narratives, the mythology, if you will, the legend attached to Jesus, or in Suetonius, he talks about Augustus, Caesar Augustus, Julius Caesar. You can look at Alexander the Great, right? They all have these birth star narratives. And in fact, when we say apotheosis, right, in the Greek world, oftentimes the being, the man, becomes a deity, or another way of putting it is gets consumed into the heavens and becomes a star. So my question is, how far back? I mean, I've seen cave art with Pleiades. It looks like there's
allegedly Pleiades. You're talking about the Bull and the Lascaux caves. Yep.
Yeah. I'm wondering at the star, how do stars in the heavens play a role as far as we can tell? Because a lot of this is speculation. They played some significance. There's no doubt about that. It's a matter of what. And is there any way to know?
I've got to be honest, I'm a little skeptical over the astronomical impact of things because it's so hard to prove. So I have to approach it with caution. I mean, so the Pleiades you're talking about is on the shoulder of a bull in the Lascaux caves in France. And if that is the Pleiades next to Taurus the Bull, then that's it's the earliest representation of Taurus the Bull. But then Taurus the Bull disappears for 10,000 years before it's represented again. So which doesn't make sense if that was the case. I mean,
did it go oral for 10,000 years?
Exactly. Right. And China doesn't have the same astronomical signs as we do and things like that. And you expect them to do it as an out of Africa thing. I know there are some people who've seen cave art in the Basque region of Spain, I believe, in some of the caves there that sort of reflect some early star symbols. So they're 15,000 years old. But to me, what we perhaps forget is how important the night time was for our ancestors. Is that, in fact, the most important day, from my understanding, for our early ancestors was the shortest day of the year, to the winter solstice, because that was the longest night, and that's the night you're closest to your ancestors. You're closest to the other world because the night is longest. And so things like Stonehenge to me were built to celebrate the winter solstice, not the summer solstice. I mean, it can detect it, but its main purpose is you want to know when you can be close, because once the longest day of the year goes, you know that things are going to get better. The days are going to get longer and warmer, and summer's coming, and the world isn't going to die. It isn't the end of the world, because if in a primitive thing, you can't guarantee that the world is in cycles. You don't necessarily know that. So, I think the night was really important. Some stars, obviously, like Pleiades is, really recognisable, as is the Orion's belt, the 3 stars there, as is Venus. I mean, so many people tell stories about Venus, and nearly always, it is about a beautiful woman, because it is such a shining, bright star. So, there is some there, but I really have trouble applying it to stories unless there is some pictorial evidence to do that. I say the cosmic hunt, we know this because they talk about a certain number of people in the hunt, which represents the number of stars on the handle of Ursa Major, and they talk about some of them holding items. And so actually, if you look with a telescope, you can see there's a star next to another star, which you couldn't normally see with the naked eye. But, thousands of years ago, when the sky was clearer and people probably had slightly better eyesight, you could see that. So that's how we see those things. But no one's actually drawn a picture of Ursa Major. We just talked about the myths and asked sort of tribes that still tell these stories what they're looking at, and that's how we do it. So I'd like to understand that more, and I do have a few books about it that I will read. But it's hard to put evidence on that because it isn't genetic. It isn't.
Right.
There isn't archaeological evidence as such.
I figure there is some significance, but maybe it's one of those pieces of evidence that we just can't pin it down.
My heart would like to say yes. Obviously, they are important. They've got to be, as you say, stars are associated with many people, even little baby Jesus, there's a little star there. There was significant importance to them, but I can't necessarily place it.
Now, as above, so below seems to be, the way they saw, there seems to be a reflection, even in the way that they would build certain things. It seems that they are at least trying to mimic the sky. I've heard about this with pyramids and stuff. Have you heard anything about this, or is there any truth to it that you're aware of? Like they're trying to.
It's not my field of expertise, but I
Okay.
would say one thing about the pyramids is that everybody goes, "Well, pyramids everywhere. It must be aliens," or Graham Hancock would say something like some lost advanced civilization, which is in effect aliens, but for this, which is just nonsense. That's my own opinion, anyway.
Yeah.
But pyramids are the simplest form of building you can build. If you don't know how to build roofs, you build a pyramid. It's the earliest. Yeah, that's why there are so many pyramids, because it's the easiest thing to build. It's not because everybody saw everybody else building pyramids. It's just basic physics and architecture. So
I just figure I'd ask about that with the correlation, because it does look like the three major pyramids that we see in Giza, they one's offset. We do see an Orion belt
north, and so
you kind of wonder. I mean, at least you kind of wonder.
You can wonder, and it's always good to question these things, but to say there's this magical number of 43,000, which if you times it by the height of the pyramid, it represents the diameter of Earth, and you times it's a pyramid with a bit of a geometric shape, so it would be exactly symmetrical to the Earth's radius or diameter from wherever. So I think part of it's like it may have been by design. Who knows? There's so much about Egypt we don't really quite understand in terms of the real technology used and that. I mean, we've got some very good ideas now, but it's something I haven't really investigated because it requires a lot of time to understand it properly.
I got one more question for you, John, and I hope that everybody watching, the 260 of you, will like the video. Go subscribe to Craig and Ford. Please check him out and check our Patreon out.
Like the video, like Derek's channel. It's more important.
Please do. And I love having John on. John, you really explore things that I don't really know anybody who goes into the things you go into, which is very good. And I want to say one thing before I ask this question is that when you get into Proto-Indo-European topics, it's a sensitive area, and that people need to be cautious on what they're doing, because you're going to enter a lot of race kind of discussions that happen out there where people are trying to act like my race is better, or my race comes from, you learned it from me. And it's like, you bring such a balanced scholarly approach and showing like, cut the crap. Okay. We're all humans.
And that's what annoys me by people like Hancock who say, oh, this is master ancient civilization. He's in effect saying there's this master race that has done all this, and you just do not need that kind of conversation if there's no proof for it.
Absolutely. Rubbish, and you're just a breath of fresh air when you get over there, especially with like hardcore racism that comes from Caucasians and such, that they really, really like to get into this. So I just wanted to say that as a caveat. Here's my final question. I have personal people who message me all the time, John. I don't know how to convince them, and I don't have all the time in the world to sit there and coach and convince them that these mythologies are nothing to fret, because they believe, and coming out of fundamentalist Christianity and such, that what if these Christians are right? And what if hell is true? What if I'm going to go to this eternal conscious torment, burning for all eternity at the hands of this wrathful deity, or whatever their particular details of this is? And I try to tell them this. It's a big question here, but it's like I'm painting a picture for this question to get the point. I hope you'll be able to approach this, is that the more you learn about the origins of these mythologies and how humans have changed the stories and how this story comes from another story, and it's like it loses that fear, that power over you of like, oh my God, I'm really going to go to this place where God's going to burn me for all eternity. It's like, if you knew where that story came from, then you would see where that story came from. The whole grip that it would have on you psychologically, it goes away, because you're realizing these are humans trying to explain why good people didn't get a good reward in life and bad people need punishment. They lived this great life, but they got to get their torture because they've been bad. There's got to be a balance to justice in the universe, in the world we live in. Like, how would you answer someone, as someone who's deep into this mythology stuff, who really believes the myth, and they are literally needing like trauma therapy because they're frightened about hell? How would you try to convince them to come out of that?
There's a few ways. So first off, there's the probabilistic view there, which is that, so what makes your God and hell more likely than the chocolate teapot in the sky, or the Buddha, or whoever, the great dragon of some South American tribe? You're just, it's just one God amongst thousands. So there's that probable view. So to me that makes a difference. But you're right. I would basically say, show me a story you believe, and I will show you the story that came from. And I can probably show you the story that came from. And if you're lucky, the story that came from. And then you'll realise that religion is made for men and literally made for men. I'm not being sexist here. Men wrote most mythology. Right. Nearly. That's why, Eve came from Adam. You don't get more sexist than that. But you'll see it earlier. That's why man pooed out the earth, not women. Men and women created it. It's always been like that. So it's
let's give them a treat, John. Let's give them a treat. Okay, someone's watching right now and they're like, you know what, I still wonder from time to time. It's a psychological thing. They were raised to believe this or whatever. And they go, well, then tell me where hell comes from, John, because I thought that the devil rules hell, possibly with his demons, or if they have a different kind of understanding of God as this omniscient, omnipotent being that literally controls hell and therefore will torture the bad people. Like, tell me why I shouldn't believe hell literally and eternal conscious torment stuff. Where does this story come from?
Okay, so that story, in effect, comes from judgment of what happens when you die. So we can show texts where there is belief in a hell, as we have now in our heavy religions. We can show where that came from. So from Persia, we see the Simvat bridge coming, and we see there's a dog on it, and so the dog will only let you pass, and the bridge will only let you walk on it if you're a good person. Otherwise, you fall into this ravine and you never appeared. But then we see earlier texts where you don't see a dog or anyone judging you, just cross the bridge to get over the river. And then I can show you a myth where you actually just cross the river in a boat. And then, and then I can show you a myth where you just swim across the river. And that goes back 30,000 years. So we can show you this story of how you get to the other world develop. And before then, you didn't even go to the other world because you're immortal. And that is so, because that's how it was. I can't, myth is completely man-made, but the reason I do this is that I'm not religious. I can't be religious because I know it's all made up stories. The Bible is just a big book of mythology to me, but it doesn't stop. Myths are the truth for our people to believe, and there must be some truths reflected in the story that were really special to them, that meant a lot, that may still mean a lot to us if we can uncover them or really understand what they mean. So the cosmogony of Indo-Europeans is around, as I say, Yimo was used to create the earth. But when you're born, it's said that the earth is then used to create you. So the soil is flesh, and the water becomes blood, and stones become bones, and grass becomes your hair. But when you die, your body goes back into the world, and your hair turns into grass, and your flesh becomes earth, and your bones become stones, and your blood becomes water. And to me, that's a beautiful, beautiful way of looking at things. And then they come up with some great words, and there's a poetic term, I say this quite a lot to people who ask, which is that they're the term that fame does not decay. So in terms of immortality, so this is long before hell was created, if you wanted to live forever, you had to have a reason for people to say your name. You had to appear in songs at the time. You had to done some great deed. Nowadays you just have to be an ex-boyfriend of a pop star, and you get a song about you. But back then you had to kill a dragon or defeat people. But basically, you die when no one says your name again. That was the premise of it. So
the Bible has remnants of this, by the way. And this king did wickedness or evil in the eyes of the Lord. And then technically, it's almost like you can imagine someone chiseling out an eternal stone evil. Like you're remembered forever as this nobody, not good.
Okay.
But this good did righteous. This king did righteousness all the days. Like there's a good and then there's a bad. And of course, this is Johnny come lately in terms of these ideas. But like they are remembered eternally for that thing. Just like Sodom and Gomorrah. People don't realize in the Hebrew, it says that God's eternal fire came down and burnt Sodom. Not that Sodom and Gomorrah is burning forever. It's that God is the eternal fire that is. So there's a lot of interesting things here about what you just described. And I hope that people who might be stuck, this is something I do. I know you don't dwell as much on this because you're just so into the mythology, and that's what I love about you. But I'm actually an ex-fundamentalist Christian who really lived with this trauma for a long time. My mother still can't get over the idea. She goes, Derek, do you think I'm going to go to heaven if there is one? And I'm like, of course. If there's a heaven, of course you are, Mom. But she really can't. I mean, I try to explain to her that it's mythology. There is no breaking through. Her entire life, she's been indoctrinated with this. And it's kind of a sad thing.
That is so sad, because if that's stopping you live a good life because you're too worried about what's going to happen to you when you stop living, then you're not living a good life. You know, you don't need a Bible or Jesus to say, live a good life, be good, treat other people well, be kind. That is being human. There's nothing special about that. That's what we should. If we all did that, life would be so much better. If we all looked after the world and gave back what we took out, the world would be so much better. Yep. It's blame the Industrial Revolution really for all this mess. Technology.
I'm really, John, I'm just thankful that you spent the time to come on here. I'm so proud of you on your channel. I mean, you're 103,000 subscribers now, brother. I mean, you literally in 1 year grew 100,000 subscribers, and I hope to see you at 1 million.
Yeah, I do it because it's fun, and you did inspire me a lot, Derek. So, as I say, I'm always here to support you when you need it.
John, thank you. I've got a super chat here, and if anybody before we go has a question, feel free to super chat your question. We'll hit them on our way out here. Daniel Whitaker, thank you for being a member and for the super chat. I understand the Basque Euskara have legends of living near Neanderthals. Has he looked at those myths?
So I think that's a misrepresentation of those myths. So because Neanderthals died out probably 40,000 years ago, certainly at least 30,000 years ago, they're definitely gone. And it's unlikely that any myths told now would be associated with Neanderthals, and maybe associated with other cultures, even from the Basque region, because we are familiar with so the interesting thing about the Basque region in Spain is that it wasn't overly influenced by Indo-European migration and dispersal. It remained an agricultural centre, so kept a lot of that old mythology, those old traditions, but that doesn't stop agricultural people layering on top of other agricultural people, and hunter-gatherers. So people will also have to remember that hunter-gatherers were bigger and stronger than agricultural farmers. If you're eating meat every day, you're going to look a lot better than eating a corn sandwich every day. Yeah, and that's actually it. So there was people talk about physical difference in giants. There actually was a real noticeable physical difference between hunter-gatherers and agricultural farmers, which is one of the questions of why were we farming them? And say so. Yeah, I would love to believe, because I'm sort of romantic at heart, but I can't. I don't think there's enough evidence to actually say that were Neanderthals they were talking about in their legends. I think they were probably more hunter-gatherers because of the physical differences.
This brings to my mind, I interviewed Gutzit Gibbon, who's big on evolution, and she's into the biology and evolution of primates and stuff. And, we kind of find these stories of dragons, even in Africa, like you've talked about. And she wonders, she mentions the group, I can't remember the particular type of human, if we could use the term, that they're really short in West Africa, that we're fighting massive. We know from the region the massive Komodo dragons that came from this area, and I mean these are literal huge lizards that would have looked like what we call dragons. These little people, and she said, if you realize. She said something that was profound, John, I think you'd appreciate. We love the stories, don't get me wrong. She said, but she's usually combating Christianity or at least some form of fundamentalism when she talks. And she said, you guys think the story in the Bible is great. She goes, you should read the story that is in the archaeology and the biology of humans, the underdog that becomes the ruler of the world. And she says they had to fight these massive lizards in these areas. And often family members were eaten, literally killed by these reptiles and whatnot.
That is a dragon myth. Yeah, that's and
she
that's
said
so
this may have been
psychological studies. Exactly. So the psychological studies say that the dragon myth persisted because we've had millions. And so when the dinosaurs died out, millions of years ago, for anybody who thinks the world is 6,000 years old, it was millions of years ago, mammals came out of the trees and reptiles. And mammals' biggest fear was of being eaten by a snake, being bitten by a snake. And so we developed eyesight that has the ability to spot snakes. Even now, if you took your child out and they didn't know snakes were in the grass, if there was one, they're quite likely spot it subconsciously and notice it. And not only that, because it's dangerous, your mind then makes it bigger than it actually is, and it implants in your memory because it's a terrifying thing. And that is why it's basically the premise that snakes are the evil monster. It is that it's the psychological aspect. And then snakes also hung around water a lot, which meant we couldn't get water, which made them associated with water. And that's it. And the South African rain snake is where all this seems to develop from, which I will make a video about one day.
Yeah, that blew my mind. And there's another little thing that I thought about, and I wonder how much of this can be explored. But when you're a little kid, we're always worried about the monster in the closet or under the bed. We're always worried about it. Like, there's something under the bed, mommy, check. There's something under the bed, daddy, check. And I think she agreed with me, but there was another evolutionary scientist guy that I interviewed, Andy Thompson, who's more of a psychologist, but he's like really into the whole evolutionary thing. And he said, you go back millions of years, we lived in the canopy of trees. All of our enemies and monsters that were after us in survival lived under us. And at night, when we fall, when you go to sleep and you're like, you have that dream for just a moment, you're falling off the edge of a cliff or you're falling out of the sky and you go and you jump and you wake up for a second and then you go back to sleep. This is a byproduct of our evolution, according to them, gripping the tree before we fell out of it to our death, where the animals or the monsters beneath us would eat us.
I could
now,
believe that.
I don't know how provable this stuff is, but you kind of wonder if this trait, after millions of years living in the canopy of trees, is still with us psychologically.
Have you got a tree in your garden? Because if you have, you could keep out overnight and see if you wake up on the floor or not. Then you
right? Yeah, it made me wonder, like, what if this is
they are. I mean, we do have inbuilt reflexes and things from millions of years ago because of that. So I can believe that. And I'd have to read the literature to put money on it, but it sounds a believable aspect. Yeah.
Man, I thank you for that super chat at the end there, my friend. And I really appreciate it. We got one more here. Daniel Briggs, do you have an idea of what a Hamsa, eye in a hand, was for, or what kind of sentences it might have inscribed on it? A new old bronze hand was found in Basque country from the 1st century BC.
That I can't answer. I have to be honest. I would be speculating. I hadn't found that, but I will now. You've said that. I will look that up, and there must be a paper on it, I would have thought. So unfortunately, no, I can't answer you, Daniel, on that question. I'm sorry. That's interesting, though.
Well, now you'll check it out.
Yeah, you don't know where it's come from. Has it? Did it actually originate in the Basque country, or did it come from, let's say, the Near East or Egypt, and ended up there? I'd have to know a bit more about that. Yes. So sorry. That's I can't be honest and say I can't answer that one.
Well, Daniel, thank you for that super chat, and I hope that we can get John to look into it. Maybe he'll discuss it.
Look into it. Yeah, and I'll email you or find something out, Derek, and you can whack it on your community post or something.
Or we can do a follow-up, and it can
I'm more than happy. So if you want me to bore you for another hour and a half, that is not a problem.
This is not boring. I think the 260-something people, 70 people, whatever, are enjoying it.
Well, John, what chat? It was nice. Yeah, I hope you're having a good time.
What are you working on? I'm going to give a little plug for your channel here again.
So, I'm currently doing a piece of work on something called the Mythology database, and that is where I've translated over 30,000 pages of Russian text on mythology and made it searchable and added geographical information to it. So it allows you to see myth dispersed across the world. Hopefully I'm going to talk to Harvard about that in the coming weeks because they were really after that. So that's a mini project. Apart from that, I'm just making videos and working at the university, keeping people happy or unhappy, maybe. I don't know.
Well, I hope that you keep doing what you're doing. Everybody, go subscribe to Crekenford. I'm telling you, this is an amazing YouTuber, great guy. As you can see, one of the things about you is I really enjoy your humbleness in the approach and your gentleness in the subject matter, but also your love for it, which is what shined when I first met you. And I said, "Ooh, I gotta have him on," and we connected. And man,
Yeah,
you're on a successful up and coming, like you're going to keep going. And I'm just glad to be friends with you. So thank you.
You'll get there, Derek. Don't worry. You deserve it more than me. I've been lucky. You work hard. So you do deserve it.
I really appreciate that. You can help us out if you want here on the Patreon. Some people say Patreon. Some people say
it's Patreon.
Patreon.
Pronounce it.
Either way, I've got a lot of videos on there. You can private message me there as well. If you enjoy what you heard, or if there's certain ideas for future topics, you can go and, I obviously listen to people who help support what we do to help direct some of the content in the way that we go. And if you like John, let me know. Let's have him back. I love John. So
please, chap.
Yeah, seriously. Thank you so much. Never forget, like the video and check out the Patreon. Please. Go subscribe to John. And nobody forget these 3 words. We are MythVision.